Hello, and welcome to Learn Linux Now. I'm your host, Edward. This is part 2 of session number 6, where we discuss using desktop Linux. Hopefully by now you've caught up and watched my previous sessions, and we're in session 6. We're doing a little bit more of a deep dive in using the desktop Linux. And in this part 2, we're going to look at the command line. There's going to be times, unfortunately, I hope it wouldn't be daunting to you, and it may be daunting to most, but there may be times that you will have to use the command line. And I encourage you to kind of take this with a little bit more courage, because the command line, it can be incredibly useful at times. It's a super powerful tool that can be used within Linux. Now, it also is to note that there may be times, actually, desktop Linux has gotten so much better over the years that you may not even need to use the command line, but there are times you will. But for you, using everything GUI may be sufficient. But even so, I wanted to go through the command line because, again, it's something that we shouldn't be scared of, and it is an incredibly powerful tool. Now, one thing it is to note, and I'm going to bring up my my virtual machine here, is that within a desktop environment, you'll have something called terminal emulators. And here I'm already logged into my KDE session, and the default terminal emulator for KDE is console. There it is. For any or other desktop environments like GNOME, you'll have GNOME terminal. For XFCE, boy, I have a difficult time with that one. You will have the XFCE terminal. And I want to note too, and I don't have this in my presentation or even noted online on my website, but you're not confined to what the desktop environment gives you. In other words, within KDE, if I wanted to, I can install other terminal emulators. Some I have used in the past that I have find very useful and pretty amazing. Or Tilex is a terminal emulator, Terminator, Gwake, to name a few more. Those are some other terminal emulators that you can install and use, and highly customizable. I mean, you can do all kinds of cool things with it. For example, like with console, and one thing that I really enjoy, I'm going to use a command, I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut here, but you can actually split your views. You can split your views here to right and left, or up and down. And if once you start, say for instance, if you're doing a lot of coding, maybe you're writing shell scripts with and even scripting with Python, maybe you're doing some other coding within Linux, having multiple terminals open is incredibly useful. But that's one thing that's really become pretty common with a lot of terminal emulators. And also I wanted to take note that within Linux itself, you don't just have terminal emulators, but you also have what's called the teletype, or it's just a terminal. It's basically the system console, and most of the time you're going to be presented this if you're using a headless Linux, in which you don't have a desktop environment installed. But say for instance you are within desktop environment and you want to, for whatever reason, you need to access the system console, the actual TTY terminal, you can use command line keyboard shortcuts to access this. So within my virtual machine, I actually can send a Control-Alt F3, and that'll bring me to the actual terminal, and you would log in as normal. And you have your prompt, and that's where we get into your basically shell prompt, and within the default for all, if not, I mean most, if not all, Linux desktops is the bash shell prompt, and or called, it comes from the term born again shell, and you can read more about that online, but this is the shell prompt, this is the bash shell prompt. And the thing about Linux too is, again, it's so versatile, is you're not limited to just to one shell prompt, and I wouldn't recommend this to beginners and novice. As a matter of fact, I kind of consider myself a little bit more of an intermediate. Maybe some would say maybe a little bit more of an intermediate who know me, but you have other shell prompts in the Korn shell and the Z shell. These I'm not too versatile in those, and I prefer not to use those, but you may find yourself looking into these more and preferring these shell prompts. But as a whole, for the default, you're given the bash shell, the born again shell. And if you'll notice, when I bring up the terminal here, as you'll see there, it says TTY2. So I have access the Teletype Writer Terminal 2, and you can actually you can continue on. You can actually choose different ones if you wanted to. You can go into number 4. I'm gonna go ahead and type in here if you ever need to. And I haven't found personally myself that I ever need this. And of course you can log out. We'll go back to number 3. I'll log out of that. And now to get back to my regular session, I would just hit Control-Alt-F2 to get back into my desktop environment. But there may be times you will find that you may need that. Unfortunately, I mean, no operating system is perfect, and no desktop environment is perfect. You will find that your desktop may freeze up for whatever reason, and I have personally with KDE have found that my desktop will freeze up for whatever reason. There's multiple reasons that can happen. I've gone into my TTY3 and killed whatever session that may be hosing up my desktop environment, and then going right back into the Control-Alt-F2 to get back into my regular session and just continue working. So that's your terminal emulators and your shell. Now, one thing to note too is that while you're in the shell, of course, you're going to need to learn commands. And over time, you'll begin to learn more about more commands. And of course, some of the more common commands is ls for listing. So you'll list your directories here, or ls-l is an option for a long listing. And if you need help with commands, you can actually do pretty much on all commands an ls-help, and it'll give you all the options that you would may want for running a command. And this is very helpful. This is an extremely helpful tool for if you forget that you need, if you want to say, for instance, you want to, let me clear my screen here, if you want to list out hidden files. So I want to, what is hidden files? What option would I use to view hidden files, which is common in Linux that there will be hidden files. So I would actually type in -a. So ls, let's clear my screen again, ls-a. And you'll see I have a long list, quite a few hidden files here. Let's do ls-la for a long listing with the hidden files. So that's how you would access help for any and all commands. Another useful tool for getting help on commands is the man pages of a command. So I'll type in, let's clear my screen again, man ls. And it basically is like a manual, if you will. It's kind of gives you, help on how to use that command. And you have quite a few pages here of some useful information on that command. Personally, I'm not a big fan of man pages. It's not to say it can be useful at times, and it has been useful at times for me. But one thing I have, especially when I first started Linux, I have struggled with using man pages is that they never included examples of how you would run that command or what that option would look like. And I think that's a failing of, my personal opinion, a failing of man pages. Hey, Ed here. Sorry, I got to interject here. I completely forgot to include this, so I thought I would jump in. But I forgot to mention how to quit out of man pages. And that's just simply a matter of hitting the Q button on your keyboard. Man, ls, going into the man pages of the ls directory, I hit the Q button on my keyboard, and I'm out. That's it. Now back to the regular video. So something that is a little bit more useful, I think, than man pages is info command. So if I do info ls on info on the listing command, I have tons of information, some really good information. You even have pretty much a table of contents of what you want, of what's discussed in for the list command. And one thing I have found that's very useful too, in a lot of cases, is that there's even examples. A lot of the times there will be examples mentioned in the info tool. Like I said, there's pages and pages and pages of information here you can read about using the list command. Of course, there's, as you can see, there's a lot in it. It may be a little bit daunting even for that command, but even so, it's incredibly useful, I have found at times, versus the man pages. So that's the command line pretty much in a nutshell. One thing I don't have in my presentation that I want to mention is a really good tip I use very frequently. Matter of fact, it's pretty much become muscle memory for me, is using the tab completion. Say for instance, it's especially useful when you're listing out directories. So if I say, for instance, if I want to list out directories, I'm going to do ls. I like using the -L option. I can type in a D and hit the tab twice, and it tells you all the directories. If I want to do desktop, I just do the tab completion, and it'll give me that ls-l doc tab documents. So tab completion is really good, and it's actually helpful for even commands too. Say for instance, I want to do ls, and I can do tab completion twice, and it'll give me a listing of all the ls commands. There's, as you can see, there's other commands for the listing. Say for instance, let's look at ls USB. It'll give me a listing of all the devices that are connected into my USB ports. Of course, since this is the virtual machine, you're not going to get a whole lot there. Or I can even do an ls, as you can see here, I can even do an ls-blk, and that gives me a listing of all the bulk devices, or the devices that are on my machine, and these are actually virtual disks that you'll see listed there. And then even a physical machine, it'll list out your disk. So tab completion, again, I don't forget about tab completion when using command line. It's an incredibly useful tool. And that's pretty much it for this session. I wanted to kind of keep this short and sweet. And if you have any questions or comments at all, I please encourage you to comment either on this video or go to my website and go to the comment section and ask me questions. I will try and help you as best as I can on using the terminal and terminal emulators. But for now, I ask you to take care of yourself and be kind.